Hello, I just want to record a quick video to talk about a book I just finished. I don't have as much to say about this book as I normally do. Um, it's The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History by Serhei Plokhy. Plokhy, I really hope I'm saying that name right. Plokhy is a Ukrainian historian, and so, especially since I'm just suddenly getting more interested in Ukrainian history and learning about the culture, and history and stuff like that. I was very excited to read this book. Plokhy has a pretty good reputation. Obviously, the recent events, although they're probably personally pretty devastating to him, have been really good for his career because all of the books he's been writing about Ukrainian history have suddenly become much more interesting to people who otherwise wouldn't care about Ukraine. Um, Anyway, I think Plokhy is a pretty great writer, a good academic. I've seen like videos where he talks, like gives lectures. He seems like a really smart guy, and I want to offer that preface before I say that this book completely sucked. God, it was so bad. The thing is, so going into this, knowing that Plokhy is a historian, what I was expecting was a history book, and that's absolutely not what I got. And in retrospect, it's very obvious that that's not something that I should have expected. That's not something that's even possible. Because, I mean, I think I'm going to call this book a failure. It's a failure in the sense that it's just straight up not a history book. And I think the failure of this book is really obvious to anyone who understands how history gets written. Because the problem is that, that the event isn't over. Like, the fact that the beginning of this war happened in the past does not mean that you can write history about it yet. Um, it's weird and interesting because uh, the fact that the events are ongoing makes it impossible to really like fully definitively tell the story of the beginning of the war even. And I don't know, to people who aren't used to thinking about history and what history is, this might sound really weird because those events, they happened, they're done, it's not like someone can go back and change them. So why can't a historian just tell you what happened? And the problem is that we're not going to know the significance of those events, like what sort of narrative there is and like the narrative arc until the war itself is over. Um, and so I really appreciate this book as a sort of audacious attempt at doing something unusual and difficult, but I do think that it's ultimately a failure. Plokhy basically just ends up telling you what the news is. Like, it's a recap of like it's a recap of like almost 2 years of news, which is nice. I mean, it's something that I needed. I wasn't paying as much attention as I would have liked to for those past 2 years. So it's a good book to get you caught up to what the news is in Ukraine right now, but it isn't a history book because the war isn't over. And to make this a lot more like concrete in the way that it isn't a history book, um, there are a lot of things where there are a lot of topics in this conflict that I would want a historian or some sort of academic to look at seriously, like look at and from all sides and like investigate in a serious, rigorous way, not the way that a journalist would, but the way that a historian would. And Plukky cannot do that for some of these topics, and the reason that he can't do that is very concretely because the war is ongoing, because he has a responsibility not just as an academic to figure out what the truth is, but as a Ukrainian to put out narratives that are conducive to victory. So one example is the Azov Battalion, which I was really interested to hear a lot more about from a Ukrainian. The Azov Battalion's been in the news a bit. They until 2014, they were, I think, pretty much. I'm sure people dispute this, but I can't think of a good faith way that you would dispute it. A fascist battalion, a fascist organization, Um, yeah, just a straight up fascist organization. And then they sort of rebranded themselves in 2014. I'm a little bit skeptical. People who pay any attention to their fascist origins, which is quite uncommon, usually this stuff just gets swept under the rug. But people who pay attention to their fascist origins will say that they rebranded, that the organization that existed after about 20, I think it's 2015 when they rebranded, but I'm not exactly sure. The organization post 2015 is merely a heroic battalion with far right politics rather than a straight up like pro Nazi, like fascist battalion, the way that it was before. And I guess since you might not just believe me that Azov was definitively a fascist battalion. Their insignia included a symbol called the Black Sun, which was created by Himmler. I think it was Himmler. It was one of the big Nazi officials, and this symbol is literally like more fascist than a swastika. The swastika at least has like Hindu religious origins. It's like arguable, you know. If you see a swastika, it's at least feasible that that person isn't a fascist. The Black Sun was created by Nazis to signal to other Nazis, "Hey, I'm a Nazi." Um, there's no reason to put it on your insignia other than to say, "Hey, I'm a Nazi." In 2015, they took it off their insignia, which, if you're being charitable to these people, it means that they aren't fascists anymore. If you're not being charitable, it means that they saw that it was necessary to at least be plausibly deniable. Anyway, the narrative, the discussion in the West, in the circles that I um, am a part of, is that basically these guys are definitely fascists and that they are making a contribution to the Ukrainian defense, but that it's unfortunate that a fascist group is getting so much positive media representation. Um, and I've just been really curious to know what a like serious Ukrainian political analyst would say about this. And Plokhy just completely sweeps it under the rug. It doesn't come up. Like he mentions the Azov battalion, he mentions their defense of I think the city of Mariupol or something like that. Um, and I think he broadly alludes to them being controversial, but he doesn't actually bring up these claims, which I think are very important. And I think, in retrospect, after the war is over, will be something that people talk about a lot as, I mean, I'm just guessing, but I think it'll be something that people talk about a lot is like the way this group was portrayed and the way that they are or aren't symptomatic of like a broader issue in the Ukrainian military. And I don't know, I was just really excited to hear an actual Ukrainian academic discuss this problem because I kind of don't trust Western commentators to give it the full like nuance that it deserves. Um, and I haven't heard anyone anyone claim and defend any position other than these guys are just fascists and that's the end of the story, or these guys are obviously not fascists and that's the end of the story. And neither of those is fully satisfying. Both of those, I feel very strongly that both of those narratives are just like expedient political narratives that are aiming to achieve a goal. And I guess my hope with this book was that it would be some of the only writing on the ongoing Ukrainian war that isn't just expedient political narratives. But, of course, and in retrospect, this just can't happen, Plukhy can't write that way. And the reason he can't write that way is that a thorough examination, like let's just use the Azov example, a thorough examination of what Azov is, what they represent, blah, blah, all that stuff, would be somewhat disheartening to Western readers of his book. And there are plenty of them. And the problem with that is that, yes, Plokhy wants to inform, but he does not want to inform at the cost of potentially alienating his Western readers. And so whenever he gets to one of these topics, the stuff that is super interesting to me and that I would just love to, find some book that actually talks about this stuff. Whenever he gets to one of those topics, he just sort of sweeps it under the rug. And in his unwillingness to, take those things seriously, really grapple with them in a way that is oriented towards the truth rather than towards any sort of like expedient political narrative. I think he basically just makes this book into a recap of 2 years of pro-Ukrainian journalism, which, to reiterate, I think is fine. If that's what you're looking for, then this is totally the book for you. You missed the last 2 years. You weren't reading the news properly. You want to know what happened. This is a Ukrainian who's telling you what happened. A Ukrainian who's been paying attention and understands the broader significance within the context of history. Like, that's really great. But it just isn't a history book. To give another example of where this becomes a problem, is in Plokhy's discussion of the uh, potential for Ukrainian victory. I am not an expert on this stuff by any means by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and and besides that, like, all the experts seem to have been wrong about the early stages of this war. Everyone seemed to think, oh, the Ukrainians are like a doormat that Russia is going to stomp their boots on, and then that'll be that. And that is not what happened at all. But Plokhy's discussion of why that is doesn't. Um, I mean, I can't quite put my finger on why. Maybe just the context of the way that he talks about the other topics, but it feels like I'm just reading like propaganda. And I don't even mean that in a disparaging way. Like, it's pro-Ukraine propaganda. It's propaganda for the good guys. But I just feel like if Plokhy, and he's probably smart enough that he does have some ideas about this, if Plokhy had doubts about the how winnable this war is, if Plokhy saw some, contingencies or some serious problems, I don't think he would tell us about them. And the reason I don't think he would tell us about them is because like I said, yes, he wants to inform, but he does not want to inform at the cost of alienating a Western audience from the Ukrainian cause. So, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting. I would say, this type of material, in terms of my overall assessment of the book, it fails at fundamentally what it's trying to do. The subtitle is a really interesting one, The Return of History. He doesn't get into it, which is a shame because it's the most interesting part of the book. But his idea is basically that what this represents, his first stab at doing actual history, like actually giving a narrative to these events, is to say that the Russo-Ukrainian War represents a return to history occurring. Like, we had this weird sort of Francis Fukuyama phase from the end of the Soviet Union that we feel like is kind of coming to a close, where, the world order is established more or less as it is, and it very much feels like it's going to stay that way. And even if it's not going to stay that way, that mood of permanence is prevalent enough that we've sort of locked ourselves into this period. I don't know, I feel like I'm speaking very vaguely about this, but the point is that people thought history was over in 1991, and at certain points we felt like, oh, maybe history's not over, but the mood has still not completely gone away. And his claim is that the Russo-Ukrainian War represents a definitive reintroduction of history. My critique of this idea is that, it only the Russo-Ukrainian War could only mean that to a European who hasn't been paying attention to global politics. Because for Americans, the end of the end of history was obviously 9/11. Like, 9/11 was the point at which our history resumed for Americans. And for many other parts of the world, history never ended. Like, the thesis that the fall of the Soviet Union somehow represents a definitive answer to what's going to happen in history is kind of ridiculous. So I think this only really makes sense as a thesis if you're like some guy living in Germany and you're not really paying attention to what's happening in the world. You don't really get why 9/11 is a big deal. And then all of a sudden a country that is like, 2 countries away is fighting a war against Russia. But still, I mean, I still think it's an interesting thesis because to some extent the zeitgeist of these things is very important. And even if there is a critique to be made that like history never ended for most people, like the fact that we entered into this mood is important. And I don't know. I just think it's the most interesting topic in his book, and I really wish he would have spent more time on it. But I think the reason that he kind of can't spend more time on that is because, well, number one, he could just be wrong. I think it's kind of embarrassing to go out on a limb on this stuff and try to write history for an event that's ongoing because you could just be incorrect. Um, and the other thing is that, like I said, he can't actually write history because he still has a vested interest in like supporting one side over another. Um, and this is not just to say, I want to reiterate, like, this is not just to say that historians who are too partisan fail to write history. Like, that's not the case. I think historians can be very partisan and still write history, but the problem is that this book is almost postmodern in some subjects where the truth of what he's saying is less relevant than the like effect that it will potentially have on readers, and he has to take that approach. Like I would do the same in his situation because you know what, you're gonna tell the truth that might get more Ukrainians killed? Of course not. Uh, Yeah, I'm trying to think. Okay, that's the main thing I had to say about the book is that it's an interesting project that I think ultimately fails. I'm trying to see if I have anything to say about the like Russo-Ukrainian war itself. I kind of don't. Like, I'm interested to see. I almost wish I could just skip ahead to the end of the war and see what it means because, well, first of all, it would be awesome if the war ended. That would be really cool. Um, but I do feel like we're at this sort of crossroads with this event where, it could end in the next year and then the meaning of the war would be very, very different, If it ended, if Putin had a stroke and then the war ended and there were like no Ukrainian territorial concessions and I don't know, as long as we're wish casting here, let's say Ukraine gets Crimea back. Then I think the meaning of the war would be a definitive like vindication for the European projects that like this sort of EU NATO like alliance structure is a good idea that can prevent global violence. Whereas I think if the more likely outcome happens where this war drags on for another 5 years or God save us another 10 years or something, and eventually Ukraine is abandoned by their Western allies and forced to give up some territorial concessions. Then I think the meaning of the war will be very, very different. And Ploki, the thing is, he can't, like, what's so weird, and I know I've hit on this point a bunch of times, um, but uh, it's just so interesting to me, is that Ploki cannot really engage with that second possibility because in talking about it as a possibility, he actively makes it more possible. It's like sort of a historical self-fulfilling prophecy because if you say, well, maybe Ukraine can't win, well, then the Western readers and voters are going to read that and say, like, well, I don't know, should we really be supporting this like losing battle? Um, and even from the Ukrainian perspective, I mean, what does Ukraine gain if they fight a war that can't be won out to the bitter end? They just lose. They just have a bunch of people die. They maybe prove a point, but what is that? What is that point worth in lives? Whereas this other possibility that the war will end with a definitive Russian defeat, with a full vindication of Zelensky and his approach, and the not trading territory for peace type of approach. um, I think by engaging with that, again, he actively makes it more possible. So I don't even know if this is a good video because I'm like working out what I think about this book while I'm talking about it. But it's weird that like which potential future reality he engages with to some extent becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so he's forced to engage with the more optimistic version because he doesn't want to play even a small role in making the negative bad outcome come true. Um, Anyway, it's a really interesting book. One way or another, it will age very weirdly because he's trying to write like a. You know what I think this is the snappy explanation of it. If journalism is the first draft of history, Plokhy is writing the second draft of history. We can't write history yet, but he's at least making some notes in the margin. He's coming up with an idea for what the history might sound like once it finally gets written. Um, It's an interesting concept. Okay, so for my overall assessment, I think it was pretty good. If you're not interested in the Ukrainian situation, this book is not going to make you interested in it. Um, but if you want to catch up, if you want to catch up on the last 2 years of journalism that you missed, this is a much better option than reading a bunch of CNN. And also, Pluk, he's an interesting writer. He's a little bit didactic sometimes, and I'm not crazy about that. But he's intelligent. He defends his position intelligently. It's a pretty good book. If you're interested in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian situation, I would say go ahead and read this book and read it sooner rather than later because, as I said, it's going to age very weirdly. A year from now, this book might be completely irrelevant. A year from now, this book might have been vindicated, and we might actually find, Plokhy might have released the real history once the events are actually over. So anyway, interesting book. Not really a success, but interesting nonetheless. Okay, that's what I had to say. Bye bye.